Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone, and may God's peace be with you. I went to a primary school, a Catholic primary school and a Catholic secondary, so there's a little bit of anxiety, I have to say, sitting with all these Catholic principals and teachers and the like. I went to Marist College, Canberra, so at that time most of the leadership were brothers who weren't backward in coming forward with the strap and the like. So I didn't see no strapping children up there, but I'm going to take it that I won't get in trouble too much today. But I am very excited to be here with you this afternoon because most of my time in my professional life has been spent within Catholic organisations. And I wanted to start by acknowledging that, the last couple of years have been really quite difficult for us within the Catholic community. Before I started the project that I'm going to talk to you about today, I spent quite a lot of time going around the country talking to people from different walks of life about the Royal Commission and what was going on. And I remember meeting with one of the brothers from my school, a man that I admired more than anyone else. And I remember him reflecting on the fact that our school, Marist Canberra, was one of the case studies for the Royal Commission because one of the Marist brothers there had sexually abused some students. And the pain that he exhibited was significant. He said, I can't believe that I didn't know and that students didn't come to me to tell me that this sort of stuff was happening. I was a little bit surprised, as so many of my peers were around that, because we kind of all knew that this man was a bit dodgy. We all knew that he was an unsafe person and that we shouldn't spend time alone with him. So we were quite surprised that there was a mismatch between what we knew and what we thought and the concerns that we had and that of the school leadership. So it really brought home to me a couple of things. A, that a lot of us are experiencing significant grief around our Catholicity, that a lot of us are carrying guilt and shame in relation to what the church and its organisations have and haven't done. But also I think, for those of us who've been around for some time, I've got this inkling worry that maybe we didn't do enough in the past and that maybe we won't open and accessible enough to children and young people to enable them and empower them to come to us when they need support. As was mentioned, I work with the Institute of Child Protection Studies at the Australian Catholic University. We were set up in 2005 after the Varden inquiry into abuse of kids in care in the Australian Capital Territory. And very early on in the piece, in response to one of the recommendations of that inquiry, we started to develop an evidence base which was very focused on children and young people's own experiences. The Varden inquiry, like most inquiries, said that then we need to do youth participation better, we need to engage children and promote children's voice more. So one of the things that we tried to build very much into our work was around talking to children and young people about their experiences. As noted, as part of that broad research agenda, we conducted a number of studies for the Royal Commission, one of which I'm going to speak about today, but we also did another study which I really want to point you to in relation to adult responses to concerns that they have about their peers, their partners and their own children in regards to problematic sexual behaviour. I might talk a little bit about it as we go through, but one of the key findings of that report was that people were still really quite anxious about having conversations about appropriate and inappropriate behaviour, particularly when it was relating to their partners or their children or people that they had a strong personal and professional relationship with. And that'll come through, I think, too, in the discussion that I'm going to have with you today about children's perspectives. The Royal Commission is very different to a number of inquiries that have occurred internationally in relation to a couple of things. One, that right from the start they wanted to ensure that victims' voices were incredibly prominent. So the individual sessions, the private sessions were a keystone of the work that they were doing, but they also wanted to ensure that the recommendations that they were going to put forward were very much evidence-based. So they've, as been mentioned a couple of times today, commissioned a whole range of research projects to look at the experience of institutional child sexual abuse, but also how we can best respond. For the first time in Australia and probably internationally, the Royal Commission wanted to conduct research directly with children and young people because they were aware that a lot of the focus of the Commission was going to be on past experiences of abuse when they realised that actually in some circumstances children in the modern day are unsafe. And I think that was revealed most prominently with the case study into the YMCA, the Jonathan Lord case, which again I'd suggest you have a look at if you haven't, which was very much a recent account of an experience that the Y had in relation to a young man who was sexually abusing children in that centre. One of the reasons that I think the Commission was really wanting to hear from children was because the Royal Commission recognised that the silencing of children was one of the reasons why abuse was prolific in a whole range of different environments. Justice McClellan, who's the chair of the Commission, said, "The societal norm that children should be seen but not heard, which prevailed for unknown decades, provided the opportunity for some adults to abuse the power which their relationship with the child gave them. When the required silence of the child was accompanied by unquestioning belief by adults in the integrity of the carer for the child, be they youth worker, teacher, residential supervisor or cleric, the power imbalance was entrenched to the inevitable detriment of many children." He says, "We must ensure that in the future the institution does not silence the child. The institution must work to ensure that the child can be heard." So today what I want to do is to share with you some things that I learned over the last 5 years talking to children and young people about how they want to be engaged and reflect, I suppose, throughout it in regards to how we were able to establish a safe relationship with kids and some of the things that we learned in regards to where we move forward. As been mentioned a couple of times today, we're really keen to work with CEM and other partners to try and turn our research into practice. So in the past we've developed toolkits and reflective practice exercises and the like, which all can be used by you in your schools to try to consider not only how well you're doing, but to have some tools to be able to talk to kids, because some of this stuff doesn't feel natural or comfortable, and we want to enable you to be able to talk to kids about some of these tough issues. So the study that was commissioned by the Royal Commission really wanted to understand how kids perceive and experience safety in institutions and how well children believe that institutions respond. Right from the start, I'll say that it's important to acknowledge that this is about kids' perceptions of safety. So we need to recognise that this is, just because a child thinks that something is a risk or a child thinks that an organisation isn't responding, doesn't mean that that thing is a risk or that the organisation isn't responding. But children told us very early on in the piece that adults need to respect their views and their perspectives, because if they didn't, they weren't able to be there and present for the child or young person. And if the young person didn't think that the adults knew or understood or could empathise with them, they wouldn't go to them if they did have a concern or experience an unsafe situation, person or event. So we had the Children's Safety Study, which we conducted in partnership with Queensland University of Technology and Griffith Uni. And from that, two reports came out, taking it seriously, and our safety counts. We also discovered early on that children with disability had specific issues and needs, and that we weren't probably in the best position to talk about findings related to kids with disability. So Southern Cross University did another study around children with disability and their experience of safety, and then we followed it up with another study looking at children and young people in residential care. In regards to the broad study, we, right early on in the piece, we wanted to practice what we preached in regards to children's participation. So we established some children and young people's reference groups. So we had 3. One was with a group of kids in primary school, in a Catholic primary school. I have to confess, we did go to the Anglicans as well. So we did a young people's reference group made up of Year 9 and Year 10 students. The kids were with Year 3, 4 and 5 students at a primary school. And then we also had a third reference group with young people who dropped out of school and were in alternate education. They helped guide the nature of the project. We trialled all of the tools with them. We spent time with them sitting down, analysing the data and asking them what they thought was important, what it meant, what we should do, what we should recommend. And then those children and young people, or representatives of those groups, met with the Royal Commission and said these are some of the things that we as children and young people think that you need to do. So we tried to build participation into our model as well as finding out what kids want in regards to participation. So we conducted focus groups, 10 focus groups with children aged 4 to 18. So we worked in an early childhood learning centre within schools across the country. We also met with kids in sporting groups, on holiday camps, kids in an Aboriginal youth service and school, and young carers. And from that, in that discussions, we asked those questions down the bottom around what does safety mean, how do you experience it, how well are we doing and the like. From that we developed a survey, which I'll talk briefly about, where we asked a further 1,400 plus children and young people about their experiences and how well they think institutions are doing in keeping them safe. So when we met with the group of kids, the primary school kids right at the start, they said, you know, if you're going to work with kids, it's particularly around something like safety, you know, you have to go in and you have to really get their attention. It's like, okay, well, cool, that's fair enough. Can you give me some ideas about how you might do that? And one of the girls put up her hand and said, you have to come in riding on a unicorn. And I said, oh, okay, I'll see if I can find a unicorn. Another kid said, oh, yeah, get a boombox and play music real loud. That'll get them ready. And I said, okay, boombox, unicorn, okay, any other ideas? Yeah, what you should do is come in riding on the unicorn with a boombox and playing music, and kids will eat out of your hand. I couldn't find a unicorn and I don't have a boombox today, but I have got a clip of things that children in our young people and young people's reference groups told us, and there's the backing of Pharrell Williams' Happy, because kids at that time were quite excited about that song. So you can hear from kids themselves about why they thought it was important for us as researchers and for the Royal Commission to hear from kids about issues of abuse and safety. But basically, kids were telling us that it was important, that they felt that they were the ones who were most going to be affected by issues around abuse, child abuse and neglect, and that they wanted to be a part of it, that they wanted to be able to listen to adults and to share in a conversation about safety so that they could work out what was actually going on for them. But they also felt that sometimes adults didn't really appreciate what it was like to be a child, to experience, you know, some of the fears and concerns and worries that kids had, because now with their adult brains they weren't in a good position to think about what's going on for kids themselves. So one of the first activities with kids was to try and understand what safety actually means to them. Most studies that have been done in the past, adult researchers come in with some ideas about this is what safety is about, and then ask kids, you know, how they're going in relation to those aspects. But we wanted to take a step back and actually try to understand what safety meant to kids so that that could guide the research project itself. So we did these safety maps, which I'm sure you do all the time with your kids, where we asked them to, when they heard the word safe, what are some of the things that spring to mind? What are some of the feelings? What are some of the reactions that you had? And it's lovely to hear from the students this afternoon where you did a similar kind of activity. We then asked them what makes them safe, where are they most safe, who are the most safe people, and when do they feel most safe, and did the same activity then in relation to being unsafe. So what did we hear? Well, one of the first things that really came through quite strongly was that being safe and feeling safe are two related but very different things. Kids said that they could be safe and feel unsafe, and more often than not, they could feel unsafe even though they were very safe. And in fact, they said sometimes adults do things to keep kids safe that make them feel unsafe. So they talked about bars on windows and security cameras and the like. They said, you know, adults are doing that to make sure that we're okay, but it just reminds us all the time that we're not safe, that someone could hurt us, that someone could come in and abduct us and the like. So kids talked about some of those things that they did. Older groups of young people talked about stranger danger and said, you know, that stranger danger thing's the worst thing, because we're all scared of adults now, because we think that every adult that we don't know could be a stranger. And you know, I reckon adults are scared of kids too, because they don't want to look like they're a pedophile or doing the wrong thing. And, you know, probably very much struck a chord with me. I carry my working with children trick around with me everywhere, because sometimes, you see a child fall over in the middle of the shopping centre and all of us go, oh my God, this is a kid who needs some adult help if their parents not around. But all of us also stand there going, should I intervene? And how are people going to reflect on that for us? So, kids were concerned about some of the things that we as adults did to keep them safe, when it actually made them feel unsafe and made adults feel unsafe working with kids too. Children told us that kids were more likely to value feeling safe, and they felt that adults were more focused on kids being safe. So they felt that sometimes they were more anxious about having to deal with those body responses that you were talking about before, or your kids were talking about before, that they needed to work their way through that, while adults were more about looking around to see whether or not there were the risks and harms that could be affecting kids in that situation. Children told us, like our group this afternoon before lunch, that they experienced safety in regards to their body. Sometimes they couldn't articulate whether or not there was something in their environment or something an adult or another peer was doing that was making them feel unsafe, but they could tell that they were in an unsafe situation because of their body's response. And they said that sometimes all of the kids in all the groups talked about creepy adults as being their major concern. We said, what does that mean? They said, creepy, they just make you feel yucky inside. We said, well, what did they do to make you feel yucky inside? Nothing, they just make you feel yucky inside. And they said that was problematic because they would go to an adult and say, that person's making me creepy, and would be asked about what it was that they had done. And they said, I had nothing, because I wasn't sure what it was, and adults didn't appreciate my feelings and my body's response to this person, and maybe they should. It's interesting, there's a group of young women who were quite angry about the fact that there was a whole class of girls who felt really uncomfortable with one particular staff member, and they went to the principal and said, this guy's a creep. I don't think he should be working with kids. And the principal said, well, what's he done? And they said, oh, we don't know, and there's nothing we can point to. And the principal said, I'll go back and watch, and if he does something, then come to us. So they were very angry when it turned out that staff member was having an inappropriate relationship with two of the students at the school, because this principal hadn't taken their fears and concerns on board. Now, they were all very aware, because we said, okay, what would you like the principal to do? And a couple of the girls straight away said, oh, they should have sacked him. And I said, oh, well, yeah, but if they don't know, if they haven't got evidence, what do you think they should do? And they said, well, at least, if there's a group of us who are saying this person's not okay, maybe they need to be watching out. Maybe we need to be sort of sussing out whether or not that person's okay, and having more conversations with other students about whether or not this person is okay or not. So it's kind of interesting, this body's reaction, or kids very much focused on what was going on inside, and they believed that adults were very much focused on what was going on in the environment, and sometimes there was a clash between the two. To be safe, kids felt that they needed some predictability and familiarity. They felt a lot more safe in places with people that they knew and trusted, and where they could predict what was going to happen next. We talked quite a bit about unsafe people, and kids talked about unsafe adults as being those that weren't adult-like. We said, what do you mean by that? And they said, adults who act crazy or weird, or have got mental health issues, or who are drunk or on drugs or whatever, where you can never predict what they're going to do next. That's what makes them unsafe, because kids need to know what the rules are, and how to manage an adult, and what to expect from an adult. And if you don't expect that, that's a bit strange. Now, because it is a Catholic group that I'm working with, I'll give you another confession. One of the groups I worked with was with a group of young carers who I'd had a previous relationship with as youth workers. And one of the girls, I was embarrassed to say, said, oh, when I first met you, I thought you were creepy. I went, oh, okay. Well, tell me more about that. And they said, oh, yeah, it was weird, because you asked all these questions and wanting to know stuff about us and how we were feeling and, what we like doing and stuff. And that's weird, because adults don't ask you those sorts of questions. So it's kind of this thing of kids felt that adults who didn't fit their idea of what was normal or what adults did were unusual or a bit creepy. So they said, oh yeah, we need sometimes for adults to understand that it takes a little bit of time for us to suss you out and to make sure that you're okay. And they said that was a big issue for kids. One of the issues in regards to child safety was that they felt that sometimes having a child safe officer in the school who they didn't know, who was new, who didn't act in the same way as other teachers might be someone that kids find a bit weird and a bit strange, so maybe they're not the best person for kids to be able to go to. So, they said that they needed some time to be able to suss that person out and to feel safe around them before they could even raise any of their concerns that they might have. In each group, kids talked about other children and adults, people from different communities as being weird or unsafe. So, I don't know if you know Canberra very well, but the Canberran kids said that people who lived in Queanbeyan were unsafe. Kids in Brisbane said that adults and people who live in the Sunshine Coast were weird and weren't safe. Kids in the country thought the city folk were unsafe. So it was again this idea that if you were different, unusual, maybe you weren't okay. I have to say universally, kids thought that clowns were unsafe, carnies were unsafe, and what's the other one that came out all the time? It'll come back to me in a minute, but yeah, there were these universal fears that children have. I think it'll be worse when It comes out in a couple of weeks in the movies. One of the things that we talked a bit about with kids was why they thought that children might not be as safe as adults. Because very early on in the piece, children made it very clear that safety was a significant issue for them because kids are less safe than adults. And not surprisingly, kids said that it was because they were small and little. Children said, adults can do whatever they like to you because, you're small and weak and powerless and you can't fight back. Another child said there are some things that are only dangerous for kids, like it's highly unlikely that someone is going to pull over and grab an adult and put them in the car because they're an adult, but it's much more likely if you're a kid. I have to say that the Daniel Morecambe case was very much in the news at the time of the first couple of focus groups that we did for this study. So everyone was paranoid about vans. Everyone was paranoid about being abducted on the way to school. But kids felt that was an issue just for kids, that adults wouldn't be abducted in that way. One group of boys, I think primary year 5 students, said, oh no, old people could be abducted pretty easy too because they're kind of weak. And then one of the other boys said, no, they could just get at their walking stick and start whacking them and they'd be okay. Maybe kids need to have some weapons so that they can whack adults on the way to school, and they thought that no, that wasn't a good idea. But they did realise that they were a bit powerless because they didn't have things on them that could keep them safe. They were also very aware that they often relied on their parents and others to enable them to be safe. So kids talked about mobile phones as something that kept them safe, but they said, well, yeah, but if a parent doesn't let you have a mobile, there was lots of kids who were upset that they didn't have a mobile, we can't get our own mobile and we can't have that available to us to call the police or what have you if someone's stalking us or if the van pulls up outside. So kids were mindful that their lack of resources or their lack of control over resources also make them unsafe too. Kids also thought that they were vulnerable to abuse and to other forms of harm because they were kids in a world that was very much focused on adults. They said that adults can do whatever they want because adults are adults and kids are kids, and adults have to do what kids have to do what adults tell them to do. And they said it was kind of confusing because at school you're told that you should never do anything you feel uncomfortable doing, but then the teacher says if you don't do that, you're in trouble, or someone else says to them, that there'll be consequences if you don't do what we want them to do. Kids talked about the protective behaviour stuff of it's your body and you should never do anything that makes you feel uncomfortable, but then recalled having to go at Christmas time to Aunt Hillary's place and kiss Aunt Hillary even though she's got a bit of a moustache and that makes you feel really gross inside. So it's kind of funny, kids were saying there are these conflicting messages that adults tell them that they've got control over their bodies when really they don't, and that there will be consequences for them if they don't do what adults tell them to do. They also thought that adults stuck together. They thought that adults would often only believe other adults, and that if a child was making a complaint or had a concern about another adult, the adult's first response would be to take the side of another adult. They thought that was particularly the case in schools, but it came up in our studies with kids in residential care and a whole range of other settings too, where there were groups of kids who felt as if the service system or the organisation itself included adults that weren't ready to step up and stand up and say something if children raised their concerns. Adults won't usually stand up against an adult bully, one group said. Maybe it's because they don't see it as a problem, or maybe it's because they don't want to get caught in the middle of it. I think people think that it's okay to intimidate a kid, particularly if it's so that they do something that people think is good for the kid, but that doesn't mean that it's okay. Children also felt that that adults had a greater responsibility to their organisation than to children. So again, kids in residential care, said, if something happens, if there's a fight or what have you, all the workers rush to the staff room and fill out those incident reports form, because if they don't fill it out, then they're going to get in trouble from their bosses. Some of the kids in schools said similar things, that teachers have to do what their principals say, or teachers have to do what parents say. But if kids ask for something, it's always going to be a low priority, because they're not going to get in trouble if they don't do what kids want or what kids need. So there's this notion of organisational powerlessness as well. So we kind of flipped it, and we said to them, okay, so what makes a safe organisation? So as you can see, these are some of the things that children and young people said, and they're not too dissimilar to some of the child safe organisation stuff that's coming out, but it's a little bit different in some ways. So the first is that the organisation's purpose is about helping children and young people. They felt that an organisation was safer for kids if it was about kids. So they felt that schools were safer than a whole lot of other places, but sometimes they put some nuances around it. Say, for example, young people thought that pools were a place that were predominantly for young people and for families, but it wasn't necessarily the safest place because they were always getting in trouble from the lifeguards for bombing or for running around the pool. They said also it was unsafe because if you were getting in trouble all the time from the lifeguards and you did go into the change rooms and someone did something dodgy, you wouldn't go to the lifeguard to say, this has happened to me because this is the person who's been picking on them all the time. So they said, that even if an organisation is supposed to have a child focus, doesn't mean that kids will naturally feel safe there. The organisation takes children and young people's safety seriously. So kids said that, if they could suss out whether or not adults knew about some of this stuff, and had confidence that the adults did, they'd feel a lot safer. But they said that too often adults try to protect them from adult knowledge without them thinking about what the consequences were for the children themselves. So they felt that adults were sometimes uncomfortable having conversations with children, and in fact they felt that it was more about adults' discomfort than the concern adults had about children's discomfort that kept those conversations from happening. The organisation knows who and what might hurt children and young people and how to best keep them safe. Staff talk honestly to children and young people about unsafe people, places and situations and what they are doing to keep kids safe. It's kind of interesting, in a number of focus groups we did with kids in alternate education in boarding schools and in residential care, kids were really surprised about the Working with Children check when they heard about it. I went, what do you mean? They said, why has no one ever shown us their Working with Children check? We're the ones who are supposed to be getting protected from it, and we're the ones who are supposed to be able to suss out if someone's safe or not. The best way for us to know if they're safe is to see their Working with Children check, but no one's ever even thought about doing it for us. So it's kind of interesting that kids thought that until they knew what adults and organisations were doing to keep them safe, they wouldn't have confidence that the adults and the institutions were aware of the issues, and they believed that sometimes that might keep them from going to them if they needed some support. When they're unsafe, children are given a say on what should happen. Adults act on their needs and wishes and let them know if they can't. A couple of young people that we spoke to who had experienced abuse said that it was really great when they did first disclose, because the teacher at school sat with them and held their hand and told them that they were going to be there with them, that it wasn't their fault, and all those really important messages. But then they talked about the next step. After all the mandatory reporting and stuff was done, when they came back to school and people were other girls and other boys were making snide remarks about them and saying it was your fault, or, of course you're a slut, so that's how you're going to be treated, or you're asking for it. And none of the adults knew how to step in and do anything. And one girl talked about coming back from court where it was decided there wasn't enough evidence to have a conviction. And she said she walked into the school and it was like a ghost town, because all these people would just scramble off because they didn't want to say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing, and she said that she never felt more alone. So when she and some of her peers were talking about a child safe organisation, they were saying it's not just about mandatory reporting and stuff, it's about what happens next. How are you going to help me through all this tough stuff and into the future, so that this place is going to be safe for me, and I'm going to be able to restore my faith in others as well. The organisation is happy to have someone come in to check that the organisations are doing a good job in keeping kids safe. A number of the kids had seen that Undercover Boss show where someone goes in pretending to be a new employee or whatever. They said maybe the Royal Commissioners could have fake noses and moustaches and stuff and go into schools and pretend that they're a new teacher, and they could suss out whether or not people were safe. And then one group of boys thought that midgets could get dressed up as children and go into schools and see whether or not people were acting appropriately or not. But in all the groups, they were quite serious too. They said, it would be good for someone to come in and just do some spot checks with kids to see how safe they are. Other kids said, how we were saying before that you feel it in your body and in your behaviours, and you can do some things that you can't do if you're not feeling safe. So for example, if they went into a school and there was no one in the whole school that was laughing, then, because if you're unsafe, it's impossible to laugh. So if there's no one laughing in the school, then maybe it's an unsafe thing, and that gives them an idea that it's not okay. So kids said that there were things that these external people could go in and look for to see whether or not children were safe in that environment, and then ultimately have a conversation with kids about what needs to be done better. The organisation values children and young people's feedback, even when it's bad. They have things in place to make giving feedback easy and respond when they can. I'm going to flag in a minute some resources that we developed for another project for homelessness services, that worked with mums predominantly, who wanted to start becoming more child-centred. And as part of that project, I wrote to a whole range of organisations across Australia, in fact across the globe, asking for their child-centred complaints forms, and found it really difficult to find any that were written in child friendly language. Now this was probably seven years ago, and I know a lot of people have changed quite considerably over time, but when we asked kids in this project about complaints forms or complaints processes or what you would do if you were unhappy, most of them said they weren't aware of what they could do, and said that the only way that they could get their complaint read or listened to by an adult at school or another organisation was if their parents gave that feedback themselves, so rather than kids being able to do it directly. So complaints was something that kids would be concerned about. Staff are available when children and young people need them. So I'm going to talk briefly about some of kids' feedback, predominantly from the Ask Young People survey, so the Australian Safe Kids and Young People survey, which was very much based on what we heard from kids in the focus groups. Overwhelmingly, most children felt safe most of the time, and they wanted, our Children and Young People's reference group were incredibly keen for us to ensure that adults in organisations, whether they be teachers, youth workers, whoever, knew that they were doing a good job, and that most of the time, most kids felt safe. As indicated in these graphs, where the blue and the red are all of the time and some of the time. But you can see about 10% of kids felt unsafe at school, and a little bit higher in church, a bit smaller in sports and holiday camps. We asked kids and I apologise for those up the back who might find it a bit hard to read some of the numbers, but we asked children and young people to reflect on their institution and how well they demonstrated these child-safe characteristics that had been identified by children and young people themselves. So adults care about kids, adults value kids' views and opinions, children and young people have at least one adult they trust, and so on and so forth. As you can see, those pink ones are ones that are a little bit concerning. So, for example, only 27% of children and young people who were thinking about school said that they believe that adults at their school value children's views and opinions, and only 23% said that adults know children and young people well enough to know if something isn't right. Lots of kids felt that adults paid attention when they raised the concern. So about 44% of kids in schools felt that adults would pay attention. But a lot of kids across the sample felt that adults would only know if something wasn't okay if the child told them. So they said adults aren't always very good at picking up on things that are a concern to children. I won't go into this slide too much, but we did break it down in regards to age, and those of you who work in high schools won't be surprised that around 13, 14, kids started to get a little bit more sceptical and cynical about adults' capacity to keep them safe. And they were more likely around that age too to say that they would rely on their peers rather than going to a teacher or another adult at their school. But even though there is a group of kids who are in that situation, it's really only sitting around the 10-11% mark. So what we did after we spoke to kids about what makes a child-safe organisation, we then asked them to think about, well, what are some of the risks and concerns that children and young people have? So we gave them post-it notes and we developed this thing called the worry matrix. Basically what they did was on their post-it notes, they wrote down every single fear and concern that they thought children and young people their age might hold. We then repeated it where we asked them to think about younger children at their school or their organisation, and then asked them to reflect on what fears their parents or adults might have about children. But I'm just going to talk about some of the things we heard in regards to kids' fears and concerns. We then asked them to put it on this, what we call the worry matrix, where on one side we wanted to get them to think about how likely it was that a child or young person like them would experience this worry or concern, and then the impact. If they did experience this, how bad would it be? How much harm would they experience? So as you can see, rather than the top right-hand corner where it's highly likely and it's going to be highly impactful, we've got things like parent dying and terrorist attacks. So kids felt that there was a high probability that they would experience a terrorist attack at some point, and that obviously parents would die. Kids were less concerned about, say, snake bites. They felt that it was less likely to happen, even though that was quite big. And they thought the bad grades was something that was really terrible, was highly likely, but maybe parents and teachers and others would get over it. So they sort of put it there. So we got literally hundreds of these post-it notes in each of the groups that we worked with kids. We then said to them, okay, the Royal Commission's interested in what we're calling interpersonal safety in institutions. So let's break it down a little bit. So we're talking about things, worries and fears that we have about other people in our organisation. So in this case, when we're doing it in schools, we said, so they're worried about what might happen in schools between people. What are some of the concerns that they might have? But also, the Royal Commission's interested in how adults at school respond to stuff that might happen with adults or other people outside of school. So from that, they developed a whole series of things that they were worried about. I apologise, I forgot a slide in between. This is amongst all the things that kids worried about. They did talk about some of the issues that adults might not fully appreciate. So this one child said, I don't feel safe at school at SeaWorld. I don't like people. I don't like bears. I don't like animals. I don't like SeaWorld or zoos. I hate the zoo, and I'm worried the tiger will get out of its cage and will attack me and I'll die and someone will film it and put it on YouTube. So they said, oh, maybe mum and dad were worried about the tiger, but they're not worried, and they don't appreciate how embarrassing it would be to die and then for someone to put it up on YouTube. That child then sent me this picture, which is a selfie of a tiger, or someone in her group did, because she thought that was quite embarrassing. But it was kind of interesting because they said there are some things that are around these days that adults don't understand, and maybe either they think it's not a problem because they didn't come across it when they were kids, or more likely they don't understand it, so they freak out about it. So they talked in particular about the internet, and they felt that adults freaked out too much about it. This Glassbergen cartoon says, your mother and I found out you've been blogging. We don't know what that means, but we'd like you to stop. So they felt that I remember one boy saying, my dad always freaks out about what I'm doing on the internet, but he doesn't even know how to turn on his computer, and always has to come and ask me for advice. So he comes in all high and mighty as the expert on the internet and on computers, but I know that he's useless, and so I never listen to what he has to say. So it's kind of this thing that kids want adults to recognise their expertise and maybe upskill themselves so that they can give kids good advice, because they felt that sometimes adults gave them advice that wasn't particularly helpful. In one school, for example, I'm not going for time. In one school, for example, girls talked about a violence reduction program, and apparently the local footy team was brought into the school to talk to the students and give them ideas about how they dealt with bullying and violence and the like. And one of the girls said, they said one of the best things to do is to stand up all confident. I said, I'm a little girl, I've got a neck. She said that, I found that very funny. No one's going to pick on a footballer because they're big and strong and they can fight back, but I'm a little girl, and I stopped listening to them because everything they said was useless and didn't help me out. So they said if you're going to do protective behaviour stuff, if you're going to give kids strategies, it has to be given by people who understand it, and preferably by people who've experienced it themselves. So they talked about programs where victims came in and did share their experiences, or where teachers sat in circles with groups of kids and talked about what experiences they'd had as a young person, or asked students to talk amongst themselves about how they might deal with a scenario rather than coming up with ideas that aren't necessarily current. They also felt that adults were incredibly overprotective. They often talked about stories that they'd heard from their parents about when they were kids, about being able to go and throw rocks on the watershed, or to, go down to the river by themselves, or to, just have time out and they said, but adults freak out now and they won't let us do any of the fun stuff, and that's not okay. That adults are freaking out all the time and are being too overprotective. I'm not saying kids today are overprotected, but I never had to wear a helmet to make toast. Kids also, young people, young men in particular, said, adults don't understand this risk stuff about what it means to us, because, we want to take risks sometimes, otherwise life's too boring, so they need to get off our back and let us take some risks sometime, because we're not going to learn. I heard in psychology that we're not going to learn if we don't take risks, so adults need to back off. So it's kind of interesting, kids were wanting some thrill seeking and wanting to take some risks, and felt that adults weren't giving them, I suppose, some scaffolding to take risks, but in a way that sort of minimised their concerns. So back to the worry matrix. So after we talked to them about the Royal Commission, what the Royal Commission was wanting to do, we talked about the issues that they thought were highly impactful and highly likely that would be of interest to the Royal Commission. So child abduction was something that was off the charts. They didn't think it was overwhelmingly likely, but they did think that if it happened, there was massive danger for kids. Adult bullies, they thought that it was highly likely. In fact, in every group, kids talked about adults who took advantage of them, adults who used their power over them, adults who demanded that they did things and used their power to control kids rather than to support them and encourage them. Unfortunately, a lot of the kids did talk about teachers, some teachers in this scenario, but when we asked them about, how many, kids would say, maybe one in 100 or one in 20 or something, or I think one of the primary schools said 1 in 1 million. So they said that they had all encountered an adult often a teacher who was a bully, but it wasn't everybody in that situation. Peer pressure, being pressured into doing something that you didn't want to do. I probably should say, I should have said it right from the start, we didn't talk to kids about any issues that they didn't raise themselves. That was one of the stipulations for the project from the Royal Commission, but also our approach to ethics. So kids only talked about things that they were concerned about themselves rather than us introducing them. So peer pressure was something, not surprisingly, that came up across each of the groups. Bullying by a peer, again, was something that was a major concern to children and young people, and I'm sure you're not surprised about that. What I was surprised about, though, was that kids said, because we said to them, maybe bullying doesn't really fit with what the Royal Commission's sort of interested in, because it's not around abuse necessarily, and it's not about adults. And they said, but I think it is important for the adults at the Royal Commission to understand it, because kids will watch to see how adults respond to something like bullying, and if they don't have confidence that the adult is going to respond well, they won't talk to them about the big stuff. So I said, we're watching all the time to see whether or not adults are sort of listening and doing the right thing and taking our fears and worries seriously. So if they don't do that stuff well, then we're not going to come to them with the big problems that we might face. Favouritism was another issue. I won't go into that. And creepy adults we've talked about already. We then spent some time with kids. I have to say these workshops were between 4 and 6 hours, so we were able to spend quite a lot of time with kids. And we developed these safety assessments where we asked children to identify one of those post-it notes. So they'd have their own scaling system and decided which issue or series of issues they wanted to talk about. So say it was coming across creepy adults. They were then asked what would it be like for a child to come across a creepy adult? What would a child who came across a creepy adult need? How well would your school do? Would your school do well if you told them that you'd come across a creepy adult? What would your school do not so well? And what advice would you give? And so from that, we got a whole lot of ideas from children and young people about what a child safe or child responsive, there's a tautology, child responsive response to disclosures of safety concerns. And so these are some of the things that kids told us. So they wanted adults to respect children and young people, their abilities, observations, needs and wishes. They wanted adults to ask kids about what they're thinking, feeling and seeing and what they need. They said, I think adults are pretty good these days because they ask us how we're feeling and if we're okay and, are we stressed about the exam that's coming up. But no one's ever asked me if I feel safe around, other people or if I feel safe, in the school environment. So safety should be a question that people ask explicitly. They felt that safe adults were those that watched what other adults were doing and how kids were behaving, those who listened to what children and young people were really saying, those that stood up and spoke out when children and young people were being hurt, bullied or treated badly. Those trusted adults were those that do what they're supposed to do, what they say they'll do, and what children and young people need them to do, and inform kids of what the dangers are, what's being done and how they'll do what kids have asked them to do. Go back to that. This is a quote from kids who are saying that they felt that maybe schools and other organisations would be more child safe if they were not only responsible for children and young people, but responsible to children and young people. So I gave the example before about the caseworker, the kids in resi care who were worried about case workers. So they said, adults have no responsibility to kids. They say we want to know what you think or what do you want, but what's the point of asking you if there's no responsibility to do anything? There's too many things that get in the way. Like if a worker's boss tells them to do something, they have to do it. But if a kid asks for something, there's no responsibility for them to do anything. It's so frustrating. So kids in some of the groups said that things would be quite different if children could fire, but more positively, could hire staff too. I wasn't going to put a Trump reference in for the whole presentation, but somehow he slipped in. So with the the toolkit that I was talking about before, these are some of the tools that I won't talk about now, but I'll put a reference to it in regards to how we can respond to kids in the moment. to their needs and concerns. And again, these were based on what children and young people told us. So that's in regards to responding to kids' concerns, and then a couple of children's complaints forms that we put together as well. I wanted to spend a couple of minutes talking about some of the things that children and young people, particularly from our reference groups, told us after they'd analysed the data about child-safe organisations and child-safe strategies. Because kids told us that sometimes there were things that adults did to keep them safe that didn't actually make them feel safe or didn't actually make them safe. So the unintended consequences that we've had, the conversations we've had about that over time. So they felt that child-safe practices weren't child-safe when they failed to recognise children's vulnerability and lack of power. So they were concerned. A couple of the kids saw some of the stuff that had been coming about child-safe standards and said there's nothing in here about the fact that we're weak and that we're not taken seriously because we're kids. So they felt that they wanted some recognition of that. They were worried that adults often, their first response was to jump in and try to fix things, and that the child would somehow get lost in that. So one group, for example, talked about if they told their parent that they were getting bullied at school, mum would rush down to the school and demand to talk to the principal and would maybe grab the kid who was bullying you and say, don't ever do that again. And they said life would get completely out of control for them because they'd be seen as weak, and then they'd be bullied because their mum, is such a tyrant and what have you. So they felt that they needed adults not to solve their problems all the time, that they needed adults to sit with them and to give them some ideas and to empower them. They were very aware that it was sometimes there were things that happened that adults needed to take the lead on, but even if it was something like child abuse, they wanted to have some choices. They wanted to feel like they had some control, because after they'd experienced harm at the hands of an adult or a peer, they were going to feel vulnerable and they were going to feel powerless, and the worst thing that could happen was that well-meaning adults could take that away from them. They felt that child-safe strategies weren't safe when they made children feel more afraid and didn't reduce their fears or concerns, when they created barriers between children and trusted adults. So we talked about stranger danger before. When they're contradictory or don't make sense to kids, where adults tell them that they can do something and then it doesn't happen. Children were very upset about adults who said, you can come to me at any time if you've got a worry or concern and I'll do something about it. And then the child goes to that adult and the adult says, I don't have time, or it's not an issue, or go and see someone else, or what have you. They felt incredibly let down and they wouldn't go to that person again. When they weren't communicated with, when the process or practice was adult-initiated, focus-driven and accountable only to adults. So kids talked about student rep councils, for example, and a couple of the kids said, oh my God, I can't believe it. I'm on this SRC and we make all these decisions or give all these ideas, but no one's ever asked us about safety and how we should deal with this stuff that's really important to kids. So, some of the kids said, well, why don't you raise them? They said, no, Mrs. Jones is in charge of the SRC and she tells us what we're going to talk about and what ideas we're going to have, and she's going to be the one that reports it back. So kids were saying that they wanted to have more participatory processes that started from them, started from their concerns and needs, and where they felt empowered and they felt some control over the process. They talked a lot about adult allies, where they had someone who would walk with them and support them through processes, whether it be individuals who'd experienced harm or groups like SRCs. When children are not directly involved in the process and when the strategies are not accountable to kids. When they were harmed, when they had experienced or were in a situation where they were being groomed or were unsafe, they most wanted adults to believe them. When they reported their concerns, for adults to step in and take control and to know what to do or say if they were in a similar situation. So there were 3 choices in the Ask Young People survey as to what they would most need when they came across one of the scenarios that we gave. Now, Eleanor or Lena, make sure you tell me to quieten or stop when you need to. Some of the other things that children and young people were concerned about, I have lost my slide. I think I lost it yesterday as well. When we asked kids if they came across one of 4 scenarios where they were being groomed by an adult, or they came across an adult who was doing something that didn't seem quite right, who would they go to? I think it's 14% of young people said that they would go to a teacher or a counsellor or someone at school if they came across an adult who was taking advantage of them. So the scenarios we had was of a young person who was in the school play and the teacher had said that you're not ready and that you're going to look like an idiot, so you're going to have special rehearsals after school, just one-on-one, but the young person felt uncomfortable because the teacher kept asking them to do the love scene, saying things like, "I love you," and that they didn't think that it was okay. So we gave them that scenario and said, what would you do in this situation and how do you think your institution would respond? And also, who would you go to? Who would be most likely to go to? Not surprisingly, most kids said that first of all they would go to their mums and tell them about what stuff was going on. Boys then would go and talk to dads, and then peers was the next big group. And as I said, I think about 14% said they would tell a teacher or a counsellor at the school. Now that's not too dissimilar to a lot of the help-seeking research that's out there, but it does highlight again that we need to think of what are some of the barriers that are keeping kids from going to safe adults in the school, and these are some of the ones that kids identified. So 45% of boys said that they would feel uncomfortable talking to an adult at school about things like this. Girls were in a similar situation, but also were worried that things would get worse if they told an adult at the school, so be worried for them and their safety. 27% of boys said that they would be more likely to deal with this type of thing themselves. So there are some, big barriers that we need to be mindful of in regards to kids seeking support in situations when they're unsafe.